Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to do a quick grin for Ms. April. Day. My name is Stefano Giordano's. I'm the director of the Remark Institute, where I get to collaborate with Sam Paul and Amy Nguyen, and I think Lauren upstairs. Lauren Lee, who's met downstairs. I'm going to keep it short today as I'm introducing three speakers, and I don't really want to be the focus of this. So this event came about out of conversations, partly with Brooke, partly with the Center for Ballet and the Arts. Thank you, Jenny. Where we were thinking of how to be discussing contemporary legacies or 20th century legacies of the classics and discussions around the theme. So we ended up with troubling classical bodies with a double play of the gerund. Thanks to the work that Brooke and Anurima are doing together, and to the fact that we have Stuart with us. So it's a pleasure to be able to get to introduce all three of them and then give them the stage to go. So we'll go in the following order. Anurima Banerji will go first. She is associate professor in the Department of World Arts and Cultures Dance at UCLA. And her research principally concerns critical historicizations of Indian dance and its relationship to the state. She is the author of Dancing Odyssey, Paratopic Performances of Gender and the State, which was awarded the 2020 Delator Bueno Prize from the Dance Studies Association. She has also edited several books, including with Yolande Roussel, How to Do Politics with Art. And now she is writing a book called The Impossibility of Indian Classical Dance. Stuart Elden, who will go second, is professor of political theory and geography at the University of Warwick, and he's a Remark Fellow this semester. He's the author of many, many books, of which I will mention only the Foucault trilogy, which he published from 2016 to 2023, Terror and Territory, 2009, which is like the title that sounds like the coolest to actually announce. But also my personal favorite, The Brilliant and Original, The Birth of Territory, from 2013. Most of you will have encountered his blog, Progressive Geographies, and he's currently working on a project on the 20th century history of Indo-Europeanism. And last but by no means least, this is the PowerPoint there for the slide, is Brooke Holmes, the Susan Dodd Brown Professor of Classics at Princeton. She's a former Guggenheim Fellow and the author of The Symptom and the Subject, and also Gender, Antiquity, and Its Legacy. Her forthcoming book is titled The Tissue of the World. That's such a gorgeous title. The Tissue of the World, Sympathy, Life, and Nature in the Ancient Mediterranean. And she has also published collaborative and edited projects, including one with a similarly gorgeous title, Liquid Antiquity. So I think the way that we'll do is we'll go one after the other, and then eventually I will let you go into a bit of a conversation between the three of you before we open it up to questions from the audience. I want to not fail to thank the Delmas Foundation, which has been supporting us on this project of thinking around the 20th century and contemporary reception of the classics. So with no further ado, welcome to the three of you, and Anurima, the stage is yours.
Many thanks to all of you for being here today. I'm really honored by this invitation, and I'm delighted to be in conversation with Brooke and Stuart. And I want to also offer my warmest thanks to Steph and Amy and Samantha for facilitating my visit here and for so warmly convening us today. So please let me begin with providing some context for the research that I'll be sharing today. My first book was on Odissi dance, which is one of the classical forms, and it's also the form in which I trained. So through this dual study from a scholarly as well as practical perspective, after investigating the history of Odissi, I became interested in the idea of the classical category itself. And today I'll draw on ideas from my current book project, which is deliberately, provocatively titled The Impossibility of Indian Classical Dance. I realize I'm making a statement and not asking a question about this, but my book takes as its general subject the question of aesthetic genres and taxonomies. Why do we organize dances into the classical, the folk, the modern, the popular, and so on. What do these classifications connote, and how do they operate? This is especially salient because in other art forms, like cinema and literature, there's been a robust debate about taxonomies, categorization, and critical assessments of the designations that are used to partition different forms. But in the dance studies scholarship, especially in the Indian subfield, there hasn't been such a critically engaged process of looking at these particular categories. So I examined the specific category of Indian classical dance principally because it holds iconic power as a privileged sign of the state. In many festivals, in many popular cultural productions, in the media at large, dance operates very much as a signal of the excellence of Indian heritage. So I explore the performative value of the concept, that is, what the idea of classical dance does, how it's deployed, and the politics of its discursive production. I argue that Indian classical dance has no real ontological status or substance, and contend it's a culturally dissonant nomenclature produced entirely by the nexus of colonial and native elites, along with Orientalist scholars, for the purposes of mobilizing Indian heritage politics, and the aim is to establish cultural equivalence between Western and Indian art practices in service of both pro-colonial and anti-colonial politics. I explore how Indian classical dance emerged as an ideological framework and aesthetic formation, constituted first under the auspices of the 18th century colonial state, British colonial state, and later enshrined by post-colonial authorities and agencies in the wake of India's independence in 1947. So the Indian classical was invented and introduced as an episteme in the late 18th century at the very moment when the British colonial state was consolidating its power in India and intervening in the cultural sphere to shore up its own authority by instrumentalizing indigenous knowledge systems as endorsed by native elites. Classicism then first developed as a concept simultaneously, I contend, in the domains of law and theater. In fact, the very same people who were institutionalizing the legal codes were also in search of a history of classical theater. So there was a confluence there. This idea of classicism later proliferated in the spheres of literature, music, and visual art over the next century. We could say a cultural ecology and template, even a structure of feeling, was in place, which later rationalized the classicization of dance in the early 20th century. And dance was the final performing art to enter the classical orbit. And why I find this of interest is that one of my arguments that I'm trying to work on is that there's a gulf between the discourse of classicism and then what the classicized dancing body actually is. So there's a contradiction between the body and the rhetoric, and in fact, what the body is doing undermines the sanctity of the rhetoric. So classical dance first emerged as a definite category in the 1930s, and in the 1950s, it was listed as one of the 4 dance types officially enshrined by the Indian government, along with the folk, the tribal, and the creative categories. Later, in 2014, the creative changed to the contemporary. So 8 dance forms drawn from a variety of regions of India constitute the classical canon today. Bharatnatyam, Manipuri, Kathakali, Kuchipudi, Odissi, Kathak, Satriya, and Mohiniyattam. Yet despite its cultural entrenchment, I suggest there's no such thing as Indian classical dance because each term in that seemingly stable formulation can be critically interrogated to reveal its contingencies. And beyond that, there's no actual framework for the classical in the Indian aesthetic realm, historically and culturally speaking. And there is a debate about this, but that's my stance. So I suggest that the phrase Indian classical dance is a misleading misnomer, given that it's not Indian, but regional, transnational, and transregional in character. It's not classical, but a confluence of ritual, folk, court, street, concert, and parlor forms. and not dance, but interdisciplinary performance, bringing together dramatic, musical, and movement elements. So I propose the ideology was invented and then supported by Indian cultural elites to establish the value of Indian artistic practice through recourse to Eurocentric frameworks. And rather than assuming the classical as universal or reified category, the project aims to provincialize, historicize, demystify, and decolonize the classical as a prevailing genre in Indian dance and kindred arts. So I do want to highlight, yes, I'm making a very decisive claim here that Indian classical dance is in fact impossible, very much a contention open to debate, because there are many proponents of the opposing view that classical dance is in fact a reasonable and ontologically secure designation. And I want to acknowledge that's the dominant and most robust position in current Indian dance policy and scholarship. But Indian classical dance is largely assumed to be self-evident praxis. While a critical literature on the subject exists, it tends to be limited to explorations of particular forms, like Odissi or Bharatanatyam and so on, not as a whole edifice of classicism. Scholars like Pallavi Chakrabarti, Sitara Thobani, Ananya Chatterjee, and Devesh Sonaji have fruitfully engaged Indian classical dance in a critical mode, but there has not yet been a genealogy of Indian classical dance as a concept, a discussion of how it came to be, how it's even defined, what it is, and why it's naturalized today as an inherited construct in the art world. So it remains an epistemological enigma with almost talismanic status and power. So my concern is to historicize it and ask, what does Indian classical dance do? How does it mobilize antiquity and modernity? What does it enact, instigate, limit, perpetuate? Why and for whom? And these are consequential questions, not only from the historical perspective, but artistically as well, in that how we describe it and assign a narrative to it can readily constrict or expand the choreographic experiments, instruments, and potentials that are available to us. So now I turn to what the current understanding of the Indian classical dancing body is from a dominant perspective, and then I want to offer a counter proposal. So in both the popular imagination and among dance specialists, the term Indian classical dance has come to signal a kind of spectacular urban concert performance rooted in principles of antiquity. Classical dancing bodies conform in the dominant imaginary to a common set of aesthetic techniques and standards. Here we see Odissi. And these standards are disseminated in a venerated textual philosophical tradition called the Shastric tradition, and it's taught through the Guru Shishya Parampara, a rigorous system of teacher-disciple apprenticeship. The Natya Shastra, which is dated to the 2nd century BCE and attributed to the sage Bharat Muni, and allied commentaries, and I can go into those later. These are said to clearly catalog Indian classical dance's aesthetic properties. These properties include a commitment to the production of symmetry in bodily technique and spatial pathways. So what happens on one side of the body happens on the other side. When a body moves forward, it also moves back to the starting point. There's a constant return to the center of the performance space. There's a prioritization of the sculptural form of the body. And here we see a direct relation being made to the sculptural heritage that is being invoked in the dancing body. And there's an attention to the form in relation to rhythmic time. So footwork patterns which keep time, upper body which keeps in line with melody. There's an attention to gravity and groundedness by working with shifts of the weight and shape. There's an anatomical framework of the body designed as a series of juxtaposed parts that are trained in isolation. So we train the wrist, the eyes, the neck, the leg movements, and so on, what are called major and minor limbs. These are then connected by the joints to form a synthesized whole. The body combines Tandav and Lasya, or energetic and graceful qualities of movement. and the use of the circle and the square are organizing choreographic principles. So all of these properties are set to define classical dance, but it's not exclusively so. The folk and the tribal forms also use these properties. So this is a very arbitrary designation of what classicism is. The other properties are that classicism is a stylized anti-realist spectacle that produces an alienation effect. It relies on subtle evocation instead of literal representation in the storytelling element. And there are two elements in the dance. There is formalist movement called nritta, which this is an example of. It's an exploration of the elements of the dancing body without a storytelling element. And then there's abhinay, which is acting out poetry and literature, especially mythological stories tied to Hinduism in specific. So the notion of classicism drawn from the Natya Shastra tends to rest on the interpretation of the principal terminologies margi and deshi that appear in its pages. In Sanskrit, marg denotes the path or the way to achieve something, and it's frequently invoked as the analog of the English term classical. So the performance genres that correspond to the ideals and techniques cataloged in the Natya Shastra often validate their identity on the grounds of embracing these margi protocols. But margi doesn't actually mean classical. It has a much more open meaning. So in the dominant view, a classical dancing body is one that specifically conforms to the Natya Shastra and that is rooted in sources drawn from antiquity as well as the medieval and early modern periods, such as allied canonical texts on aesthetic philosophy, sculptural heritage, palm leaf illustrations, ritual practices, and other traditions from the pre-modern dance archive. And they connect particularly, I contend, to Hindu religiosity in terms of the themes and narratives that they present. So the classical body is imagined as disciplined, as a whole and cohesive unit that harmonizes disparate elements. It's refined, it's virtuosic, and a body that exhibits command over the techniques of pure dance and storytelling elements. And this notion of the classical dancing body appeared in the early 20th century as traditional art forms from different regions of India were invented or revived, standardized and consolidated in the context of nationalist movements that sought to identify a pre-colonial heritage and glorify it. So critical dance scholars have studied how part of the process of classicization also involved reassigning these renovated forms to the proper bodies. That is, transferring the dance from the bodies of professional dancers and temple artists who often came from communities oppressed on the basis of caste and class and were pejoratively described as sex workers or prostitutes. The dances were then transferred to the respectable bodies of dominant class and caste performers. So I can go more into that when we look at specific forms, but that sociological element of the dance to me is a separate point of analysis than the discursive formation, because in a way, if the category is moot, then I would contend that what happened during the process of classicization is also immediately suspect. So as a counter proposal to this, I want to offer the idea of interstitial incorporation. So the reason why classicism is also problematic for a host of reasons is that, as I've said, it subscribes partly to Hindu principles. However, those principles tend to be bolstered in the analysis of classical dance. So other religious and secular influences are largely minimized in the dominant accounts of these dances. And this is notable in a society which is multi-faith and comprised of Buddhist, Jain, Parsi, Sikh, and tribal belief systems, Muslim belief systems, as well as atheist constituencies. So the effect of this pronouncement of the Hindu element in classicism is that Hindu communities are naturalized as longstanding inhabitants and inheritors of the nation, while other social groups are framed as belated arrivals or denaturalized in terms of their pure belonging. So the dominant idea of a classical dance origins validates this hegemonic idea of Hindu indigeneity. So What is actually happening, though, in the classical dancing body is that there's a multiplicity of influence outside the Hindu cornerstone. And we see then there has to be a different accounting for what the classical body does as opposed to the discourse which is imposed on it. So the reification of classical dance has occurred despite the fact that it mediates multiple sources and citations from various places and eras. And so I propose the idea of interstitial incorporation to account for this eclecticism. This is a process by which classical dance assumes a syncretic character by absorbing plural idioms and influences, often appropriating them as well, and acquires an independent identity as a result of its metamorphosis from ritual, court, temple, or popular tradition to a standalone artistic practice. And the classicized dancing body then serves as a site of intersection for this montage of myriad influences. And that's where I'd just like to end by noting that through the process of interstitial incorporation, the translations, collections, and distillations of these vast repertoire of influences appear homogenized in the single body of the dancer, such that it's difficult to extract or identify individual citations when they occur in flow. Some citations are minimized or accentuated over time, but these souvenirs of movement from another time and place may be momentarily legible before they vanish and merge into another bodily sequence. And when bodies trained in this manner perform, the distinctions are but still perceptible, so that this solo dancing body becomes an index of multiple bodies, past and present, in its projections. And I want to offer that the notion of interstitial incorporation breaks the reification of the classicism as ideology that's been integrated into the Indian dance space, and it defies the monumentalization of the past that I suggest characterizes classicism.
Thank you, Brooke, for asking me to be involved in this. Thank you, Steph, Sam, Amy, Lauren, and others here at the Remark for hosting me for the last few months. So I was unsure how I could speak to this topic, and it was the body that I was struggling with to connect what I was doing to the theme of this. And so I decided I'd work on this piece, which is an early piece by Emil van Benist about the Sogdian word for knee. So in 1907, the British-Hungarian explorer Aurel Stein negotiated with a Buddhist monk to access the so-called library cave of a temple complex in Duanhang in Chinese Turkestan. It's relatively close to the border with Xinjiang. The library cave had been sealed, they think, around the 11th to the 13th century of the modern era, and it contained a wealth of material in a range of languages. Stein paid the monk a small sum to be used for temple renovation, and in return was able to remove a number of manuscripts and bring them back to London, or to plunder them, depending on how you want to read that story. The following year, in 1908, the French scholar Paul Pelliot arrived at Duanhang, and he made a rapid survey of the material there. And he was able to bring back a huge range of documents to Paris. You can see him in the picture there, examining these scrolls in the site of the Duanhang Library Cave. Back in Europe, various academics were set to work on the material that was brought back to London, to Paris. Stein was an Indologist, Pelliot a Sinologist, but others were brought into the team to work on these manuscripts. And the French linguist Antoine Mellet did some work on the language that was known as Tocharian B, but on the largely unknown Sogdian language, an Eastern Iranian language, he got one of his students, Robert Gautier, to work on this language. At the time, Gautier was very clearly being prepared to be Antoine Mellet's successor to his chair at the École Pratique de Haute Étude and potentially at the Collège de France too. And in parallel to this work in Paris, German scholars led by Friedrich Karl Andreas were working with other Sogdian texts that had been brought back to Germany by the Turfan expeditions. But Gautier dies from wounds that he received in the First World War in 1916. And at that point, progress on deciphering the Sogdian language in Paris slowed down dramatically. Gautier had published one volume of this sutra, and he'd published one volume of the grammar of Sogdian on the phonetics. And it was a very young Emile Benveniste who was tasked with continuing this work of Gautier. And so the second volume of the sutra has a very small acknowledgement that it was produced with the collaboration of Emile Benveniste. And so now Benveniste in his early 20s is being prepared both to succeed the work that Gautier was doing, but is also now being prepared as the person to succeed Mellé's teaching. Mellé is an important figure, not just for his own work, but for preparing the next generation of students in Paris. This is a group of his students with him in his office. And what's important, I think, about Mellé is that he doesn't just prepare people to continue the work on the languages that he was working on, but on the whole range of Indo-European languages. So just in this group, you have people that go on to be the next generation of specialists in Iranian, Latin, Slavic, Sanskrit, Greek, and Celtic languages. So it's a real generational shift from Mellé of training them in comparative grammar, but to go and work on different parts of the Indo-European language family. Now, as I mentioned, one of Benveniste's very first publications was when he was only in his early 20s on a question of Sogdian vocabulary. And it's the second article that he publishes in the Bulletin of the Paris Linguistic Society. It's a journal that Benveniste will go on to publish much of his work in, and he goes on to become its editor later. And it's around this word for knee. The Sogdian word would be zanuk, the French genou, the English knee. And Benveniste says the sense in Sogdian texts is usually clear from context, or we can relate it to other Indo-European languages. But he says that there's two instances in Gautier's edition of a Sogdian version of the Vesantara Jataka where the meaning is unclear. So this Jataka is a story of one of the Buddha's past lives. It's the story of a prince who is renowned for his generosity, to the point that he gives away everything that he owns, including, and this is the bit that's kind of slightly disturbing in this story, he gives away his children into slavery and he gives away his wife. But he's held up as this exemplar of generosity. And Gautier does an edition of the Sogdian version of this story, which is known in other languages, but he does the Sogdian version of this story. And Benveniste says there's a couple of problems in the translation that he wants to highlight in this piece that he writes about this. And these are the two passages where he highlights the problem in this. This is Gautier's French translation. I'm not pretending that I'm reading the Sogdian, I'm reading the French translations and talking about the French debate about this. So the moments that he picks on it are that Gautier translates the king on his knees ordered his son to be brought forward so that he could be named. And even Gautier puts a question mark here because he says that this doesn't seem to make sense to him. And the second one is, I forgive my son on my knees. Come back with your wife, Mandri. And Benveniste says, these don't really make sense. It's not normal that you would order somebody when you're on your knees, or that you would forgive somebody when you're on your knees. Rather, you would beg for forgiveness in that way. The figure in the position of power is not the one that's making the supplication. And in the second case, Benveniste says there's a grammatical issue here. It's addressed to the son on knees rather than the son. Sorry, it's not addressed to the son on knees, but it's addressed to the son of the knee. It's a genitive, I suppose. Now, what Benveniste does is to draw on an article that Joseph Loth had written for the Celtic Review in 1923 about an old Irish use of knee that invokes, instead of simply the body part, invokes a generation in the sense of the infant of the knee. And he says, Joseph Loth says, there's a parallel in Anglo-Saxon in the sense of a direct parent. So Loth makes the link between picking a child up and sitting them on your knee, sitting them on your lap, as a moment that a father is recognizing their child by lifting them up and placing them on their knee. And Benveniste says this seems to be much more plausible than the knee being a euphemism for another body part, or that childbirth was something that took place by a kneeling woman. And he says, even if that was the way that people gave birth, or women gave birth at that time, the lineage argument from it would be difficult. so this is Bambanese now, it's a long way to go from a purely physiological notion of giving birth to the entirely legal one of filiation. For in primitive societies, there's no necessary relationship between consanguinity and kinship. Kinship is only sanctioned by legitimation, which among Indo-Europeans is the exclusive prerogative of the father. So by taking a child on the lap, by lifting them from the ground, the head of the family exercises one of his essential prerogatives, attesting to the authenticity of his descent and maintaining the continuity of his lineage. So Bambanese says this Irish sense that Joseph Loss has identified maps directly onto the Sogdian use of this term, and it helps to unlock this puzzle of meaning in these two passages in the text. And because certainly at the time there was a relatively small corpus of Sogdian texts, there were many of these types of difficulties in interpretation. There wasn't enough of a body of literature that they could see the context of word use in a wide range of sources. And so there was a fairly limited amount that they could draw on here. So what Bambanese says is if son of the knee in those examples from the Vesantara Jataka actually means something like son as heir or legitimate son, then the difficulties of sense would disappear. The king ordered his heir son to be brought forward, or I forgive my heir son. Now, Bambanese says there's no parallels that he knows in other Iranian dialects that would have a similar expression, nor can he find it in modern Indian languages. And so he says at the end of this piece, we're still left with a dilemma, a question about this term. So we can't decide, he says, whether we're dealing here with a creation or a calque, i.e. a literal word-for-word translation, whether it's a noble or a popular expression, a chance conservation, or a living locution. But the concordance of a designation and now no doubt of an identical usage at the two most distant ends of the Indo-European world, i.e. from eastern Iran through to Ireland. This seems to us to be worthy of note and deserves to be joined to the similar correspondences that have been grouped by Joseph Ventris. Now, this was a piece that Ventris wrote in 1923 that drew parallels more broadly between Old Irish and Iranian languages. So what's interesting to me about this short 3-page article by Bambanese is that he's already working in a related way to his much more renowned later work. That a very small issue in a text that might appear to be a corrupted passage in the text that needs to be amended even before it can be translated or interpreted, he can see a way of approaching this through a comparative approach, approaching it from a different angle. But equally, the Bambanese is saying by looking at this very small detail in a text, we can perhaps indicate something about the practices of the people, about their ideas of kinship, about the idea of lineage, about the patriarchal nature of the society. Now, a few years later, Bambanese produces a new edition of this Jataka, indicating that although Gautier had done pioneering work in the 1910s, aspects of it were outdated by the 1940s. So Bambanese does a new edition that is a transliteration, translation, and commentary on this text. And I checked because it's interesting that in the two instances at stake in this earlier article, he now translates the term as if it's unproblematic, as dear son or loving or sweet son. So the king ordered his dear son to be brought in for the proclamation, or I grant my forgiveness, my loving son. And Bambanese says that this edition is completes the work of his Sogdian texts that he'd published in 1940. And that was a project that was interrupted by the Second World War because the transliteration, translation, commentary, and glossary of all of the other Sogdian material in Paris was sent to the press shortly before Bambanese was called up for his military service and published in 1940. And then immediately after he'd finished work on that, he wrote the introduction to a volume of reproductions of the Sogdian manuscripts in Paris, the Codices Sogdiani, that was published very shortly before all of the material was taken out of Paris for safekeeping during the war years. Now, Bambanese continues to work on Sogdian throughout much of his later career. This text on the knee that I focused on is actually reprinted as the very first text in the posthumous collection of Bambanese Sogdian Studies in 1979 that was edited by his former student, Georges Redard. And Bambanese goes on and works on many other languages, many other topics throughout his career. But the very beginning of his career is really fundamentally shaped by those findings of those expeditions that had happened when he was just a small child. The whole of Aurel Stein, and especially of Paul Pelliot, provides this wealth of material for European scholars to work on. And in the first publications that he has, many of which are on Sogdian, Van van East is one of the first figures in that interpretive and reconstructive work. So this is a 20th century reading of a medieval manuscript of a classical text in which a body, or at least a body part, is in question. Thank you.
Thanks for Paul. Thanks so much to Stephanos and to Sam for all their support making this possible. It's really an honor to be in conversation today with Anurima and Stuart on the subject of troubling classical bodies. And I wanted to take the occasion to talk a bit about a concept that I've started to call bioclassicism. And with bioclassicism, I'm trying to get clearer about a classical body that takes form in the 18th century at the site of two mutually reinforcing givens. On the one hand, a specifically Phil-Hellenic classicism, and on the other hand, a vitalistic naturalism. So I'm going to take the few minutes that I have today to situate bioclassicism in relation to a long-term project on ancient sympathy. This is a project that I'm almost done with. And more specifically, I want to try to give a sense of how my interest in bioclassicism has emerged through thinking about the modern reception of ancient sympathy. So in this project on ancient sympathy that I've been working on for over a decade, I trace the emergence of the concept of sympatheia in the 4th century BCE within what was being called the inquiry into nature. And I follow the conceptual field of sympathy to its consequential elaboration in the Neoplatonist Plotinus in the 3rd century CE. Now, the sympathy in question in antiquity is very expansive. It broadly designates the sharing of affects, pathe, between parts of natural bodies and between those natural bodies. From around the 2nd century or the 1st century BCE, a new and almost certainly Greco-Egyptian discourse of sympathy and antipathy becomes increasingly integrated into sympathy's conceptual field. Now, the conceptual field of pre-modern sympathy was integral, I argue, to the theorization of living beings as complex unities and the embodied relations between them within communities of varying scales. It also helps us to understand the growing significance of living things as paradigms of complex unity after the 4th century BCE, including as models for the cosmos itself. I therefore argue in the book that sympathy can shed light on the rise of a concept of capital N nature, understood as the cause of cosmic community in the last centuries BCE and the 1st century CE, as a culturally hegemonic Greek-branded natural philosophy came to interact with other cosmo-anthropological traditions within the metropoles of Macedonian and Roman Empire. Now, even a very brief sketch of pre-modern sympathy probably gives you the idea of its distance from the familiar modern sense of sympathy as something like pity or empathy. Now, it's true that one strand of ancient sympathy, which I've analyzed elsewhere in terms of contagious affect and universal kinship, traces an emotion that looks rather like our sympathy. But the more immediate genealogy of our familiar sympathy is the 18th century, when philosophers turned to sympathy as an expression of human nature in its capacity to bind newly emergent political, social, and economic communities. Now, arguably, part of what made it possible for the 18th century to amplify this new sympathy was the attack that had been leveled by Descartes a century earlier, when he declared that, quote, "there are no qualities which are so occult, no effects of sympathy or antipathy so marvelous or so strange, nor any other thing so rare in nature that its reason cannot be given." So the reason, of course, was Descartes' own new mechanical philosophy, which dealt a profound blow to the sympathy and antipathy that had become a key part of early modern natural science in its conscious reception of ancient natural philosophy. The Cartesian triumph remains a historiographical trope in the history of science, but its mythic dimensions loom well beyond that disciplinary narrative. So writing in 1998, the historian of philosophy, John Sutton, observed, quote, "a curious consensus in analytic history of philosophy, medical anthropology, feminist theory, and cultural studies at large coalesces around the image of Descartes as the anti-magus, stripping nature and the human body of all powers and activity." This pre-modern world was, Sutton writes, crisscrossed by networks of sympathies and antipathies that were sundered and lost with Descartes' blind scientific drive for the mastery, possession, and penetration of nature. And mind you that Sutton wrote this before the rise of a new vibrant materialism in the early 2000s. Banished from science, then sympathy seems to shed antipathy to migrate into ethics and politics as the glue of human community. Meanwhile, the story would seem to go, Western science sheds its fixation on the ancients along with its pre-modern reverie. In another important piece of the puzzle, at the end of the 19th and early 20th century, sympathy and antipathy are taken up by early anthropology as the engines of magical thinking among primitive racialized peoples. In this way, they become habits of thought to be diagnosed in others, capital O, by modern enlightened subjects of colonial power. These subjects both know where sympathy belongs, that is, namely between human beings, and claim to be themselves humanized by sentiments of sympathy. So perhaps it's becoming a little bit clearer, and I know this is quick, why ancient sympathy is a fraught topic for the modern classicist. So on the one hand, insofar as the sympathy of the ancient Greeks exceeded a properly humanistic or intersubjective emotion, they risk falling into the morass of occult forces long associated with the rise of magic in the Hellenistic and Roman imperial Mediterranean, according to tropes of post-classical orientalized decline. On the other hand, ancient Greek biology, medicine, and science remain still marginalized in the field of modern classics for being antiquated and obsolete rather than timeless and classical. Science has moved on. What it leaves behind doesn't look like it's worth much to us, we classicists, we custodians of eternal human value. So it's here in the zones where ancient sympathy became modern that I would locate the emergence of bioclassicism. And it is here that I locate the classical body that I think is troubled by the work of getting clearer about ancient sympathy's modern reception. So this classical body doesn't mark the unbroken continuity of the ancient Greeks into European modernity, nor does it stand for philosophical rebirth, classically patrilineal, if not liberated from mothers altogether, nor does it bear witness to pure rupture. Though it becomes an avatar of whitened purity, the classical body is, in fact, the symptom of mixture. It is, I suggest, a place to think about the longue durée reception of an ancient philosophy of nature, or what I sometimes call cosmoanthropology of nature, in terms of folds and feedback loops, diaspora, and tides. European modernity is only one of these folds in the reception of an ancient philosophy of nature, but it's a consequential one. So let me just say a few words about what I mean by the classical body of bioclassicism. So one angle on this body that I'm not going to talk quite so much about is comes via romantic Philhellenism as it responds to Winckelmann's 18th century love affair with classicized sculpture. And so I say, cue the Apollo Belvedere. Winckelmann is often read into the origin of modern art history, but as Catherine Harlow has shown, he also does important work authorizing the modern academic discipline of classics as it developed in late 18th and 19th century Germany, as it once a new science and an instrument of bourgeois nationalizing subject formation. The classical body, gendered male and increasingly raced white in the 19th century, is an incubator for fantasies of a past in which humans were vitally unified and whole. It marks a time before a corrupted modernity when the Greeks were in harmony with nature. It thus stands as an icon of natural life that comes to underwrite the valuation of a classicized antiquity. But because I'm short on time, I want to spend the time that I have left saying something about another complementary angle in the classical body that has, I think, received far less attention, namely the classical Greek body that survives the Cartesian critique of sympathy to make a new alliance with life in the 18th century. So here we're on the threshold of modern biology in the years before 1800, which is, of course, the very period in which modern classics is itself taking shape as a humanist science of antiquity. And my claim is that this vital classical body can help us see how pre-modern sympathy morphed in modernity into a site for reworking ancient ideas about life and unity after Descartes. That is, this body conspires to keep pre-modern sympathy alive in ways that are obscured by simple stories about either the rise of modern moral sympathy or the fall of occult sympathy and antipathy. So we can gain a brief glimpse of this body through the reception of a maxim from the post-classical Hippocratic text on nutriment. Now, I should have put a slide up, but I didn't. All things are flowing together. All things are breathing together. All things are sympathetic, ponta sympatheia. The maxim became a watchword of a Hippocratic philosophy of nature for the 2nd century CE physician and philosopher Galen, who almost certainly shaped its early modern reception. I'm only just going to look at a couple moments in this reception, and I'll start with Leibniz. So Leibniz has long stood at the center of an early modern tradition of thinking about animate matter that scholars have read both in terms of its relationship to Descartes and in terms of Leibniz's influence on later vitalist medicine and philosophy. In his Monadology, published in 1714, Leibniz sums up his philosophy of the monad with an abbreviated version of the maxim, sympnoia ponta, so all things are breathing together. But Leibniz's fascination with the maxim from on nutriment predates the Monadology by over 30 years. He seems to have first turned to the phrase sympnoia ponta for the first time in 1672, while he was working on the problem of how a body coheres as one. And he was starting to formulate his idea of pre-established harmony, an idea that Christian Mercer has called universal sympathy pushed to its limits. 3 decades later, in the New Essays on Human Understanding, Leibniz's major rebuttal of John Locke, he's using the maxim to describe the relations between the monads. By virtue of its perceptions, he argues each being lives in a present, big with the future and burdened with the past, and all things breathe together, sympnoia ponta, as Hippocrates said. So Leibniz, we can see this uses the Hippocratic maxim to think through unity and multiplicity at the scale of both the monad and the cosmos, and to think this through at the site of an inheritance from a classicized Greek source. We again find the Hippocratic maxim quoted in full in the first secular history of medicine, the Histoire de la Médecine, written by the Genevan Calvinist Daniel Leclerc in 1696. So, rejecting the dominant narrative that medicine was God's gift to Adam, Leclerc nominates Hippocrates as medicine's true ancestral font. Hippocrates' legacy for Leclerc is a philosophy of the body centered on the affinity of parts for one another and the dynamic unity of the whole. He sums up this philosophy with our grand maxim on sympathy from on nutriment. And in the same year that Leclerc's history appeared, the Italian physician Giorgio Balivi, an iatromechanist inspired by Descartes, made the Hippocratic maxim the capstone to his account of the human body as a tightly organized system of nerve fibers working in sympathy. Later in the 18th century, the maxim was cited by physicians in the Montpellier Faculty of Medicine, who were polemically taking their distance from Descartes by pledging allegiance to a now named vitalism. The maxim conferred ancient authority on their understanding of the living body as a complex unity of parts. But I would say I don't think it is only functioning to assign authority. I think there's a deep engagement. They're reading Hippocratic texts that are helping shape their idea of this living body. It was a robust understanding of living organization that helped stabilize the organism in the later 18th century as the object of a new science of life. Rather than insist then on a radical rupture in the conceptualization of life on the threshold of the 19th century, we might then instead think about the reception of ancient theories of sympathetically unified living beings within modern concepts of the organism. I also want to simply flag, because I don't have time to go into it, the symbiotic relations between romantic Philhellenism and modern biology in the ways that they converge in an investment in ancient Greek life. So this life, I suggest, becomes the home of what we might think of as a kind of classicized and secular magic. The symbiosis of vitalism and classicism is especially evident in Georges Canguilhem's influential essay from 1946, Aspects of Vitalism, where Canguilhem names Hippocrates, Galen, and Aristotle as the Greek deities of a vitalist tradition defined by the sympathetic unity of the living thing, and more generally, the vital unity of all of nature. Indeed, as I've argued elsewhere, the Greeks are woven into each one of the 3 aspects of vitalism that Canguilhem elaborates in the essay, where vitalism stands together with mechanism as a trans-historical pole in the philosophy of life. Canguilhem argues, in fact, that vitalism can be defined in the modern period by its persistent turn back to Greek antiquity, and an aspect that he labels the vitality of vitalism. Another aspect of this tradition, Kangyam argued, is the purity of its classicized sources, which offer respite from the corruption of vitalism at the heads of Nazi biology. Kangyam thus positions the ancient medical and philosophical Greek texts as sources for regenerated vitalism. And here I think we can see some of the lineaments of bioclassicism, especially clearly. So to trouble a classical body articulated through bioclassicism is thus to refuse rupture between ancient and modern at the site where natural life meets the good life. I've tried to surface the ways that the value of ancient Greece and the value of life have mutually constituted one another as foundational givens. That is, on the one hand, the ancient Greeks as salvific sources of vital energy and the knowledge of holistic nature for the moderns. On the other hand, life names a beautiful unity and harmony with nature that is modeled by the classical Greeks. So many of the questions we ask about living well, even today, are, I think, caught up in this trouble and the mess that we're in now. Thank you.
Can I take the first question, just very briefly? Sort of heard all three of these sort of describing, you know, these large bodies of work. And in Brooke's were the custodians of eternal human value that help build them or that build them. And in Anurima's case, I heard this as much more of a state project, consciously or unconsciously. Stuart, your subjects seem almost like they found like the single most obscure thing they could possibly ever find in order to build a kind of massive operation out of it. So they sort of look like they're a little bit out for, I don't mean this, that it is obscure. I mean that like that they're somehow like completely closed, and it's like an authority structure and a kind of legitimacy operation for retaining, you know, and pursuing a body of knowledge. That's one, but then at the same time kind of internal genre. And Brooke, in your case, you jump back and forth a lot more for me to have a sense of how this plays out in the 20th century one. Is there a kind of, is there both sides? There's both a classicism that ultimately denies a kind of bioclassicism. Is there, let's say, a kind of understanding that actively closes off this bioclassicism that Canguilhem stands up for at the end of the paper?
I mean, like, is there a kind of response, a critical response?
Right, is there a critical response, or like we need to preserve this kind of understanding and sympathy is not? Or is this somehow, is there a bigger politics to it that plays in that I'm missing? Like, wait, yeah, in a way I kind of wanted to articulate this, like who comes first or what kind of pressure comes first as we go through it.
I think it was surprising to me that the state was such an important actor in the formulation of the classical in the historical Indian context, because I expected there would have been a much more robust discussion of classicism as a point of aesthetic debate, for instance. So in looking at the lineages of classicism in this particular context, the state does emerge as a very significant force. And it's not entirely that it was a top-down effort. It's more like classicism becomes so important because it emerges as an English language concept in the late 18th century. And that's when these debates about how we can define classicism against other kinds of categories in my view really begins in a sustained way. And prior to that point, we have a whole plural sense of how dance, for example, is organized, understood, and theorized, whether in relation to a complex of other artistic disciplines or when it's analytically separated. So I find it interesting that it's at the moment of centralizing the Indian state in the British Columbia that we really have classicism emerging as a point of discussion, contention, eventual institutionalization. And particularly in the legal domain, once this happens, the model that's taken to create a classical corpus of laws is then, I would suggest, transferred into the artistic realm as well. And that model of collecting authoritative knowledge, installing it, circulating it, it follows very much that domain of the juridical. So I think it's a very interesting relationship that the state inaugurates between legal discourse as well as artistic discourse. And this idea of classicism is drawing so much cultural production together. And in dance, it's very clear that classicization rests on the authority of the English conceptualization of the term, and then also the quest to find an ancient Sanskrit source that would then further edify it. So it's the conjunction of this model of Sanskritization as well as the authority that English now holds after becoming the official language of governance. So there's this moment where there's a mutual reinforcement of the idea of the classical that's found through these Sanskrit sources, English sources. And then the body is actually engineered to meet classicism as a discourse rather than being an explanation for what it actually is. So I find that really interesting that it's the discursive impulse that creates the classical body rather than it being a process that's done in parallel or is identified as a term that can account for what's happening in the body. Rather, it generates a new body. But the Indian state chooses to continue that project. So it's that confluence of workings of the colonial state and the Indian state that's also interesting.
So I'm sorry, it's such an obscure text.
I didn't mean this badly.
No,
It's
I mean,
exciting.
it was. And I think that the positive way to say why this text is interesting is that a very small example opens up a bigger set of questions, which for me was an interesting thing because I think it does indicate some of what Banerji and others do in broader work. The other reason there was this event I needed body. And the other thing that I debated, because I thought body is fine. Okay, this is often a first language lesson. You learn the parts of the body in another language. And so I was thinking, okay, could I connect it to Henry V? There's that French lesson. And I was thinking, okay, so bodies, there must be stuff. And then I came on animals, names of animals, animal bodies, and body of the living animal and the body of the dead animal being prepared for food. And then I came across this text again and I thought, no, that would work because it would be about a body and what bodies do, because the question of childbirth and inheritance. But the scholars that I was talking about, so Banerji, but before him, Gautier, and then in Germany, the Friedrich Karl Andreas and Walter Henning and the others that are working in that tradition there, they're not trying to work on the smallest detail, they're trying to work on the entire corpus of texts that have become available to them. And that this library cave it was sealed and they put a false wall and an artwork on the wall. And they think this was done in the 11th, 13th century. It was sealed into the very beginning of the 20th. This is why all of this material was so well preserved. The problem, I mean, one of the problems of Orelstein is that he plunders all of this stuff and brings it back to Western Europe. But the other big problem with Orelstein is he doesn't label how things were arranged when he first started to go through things. Even though he was an archaeologist, I mean, my understanding is that's kind of archaeology 101, is if you disturb things and layers, you leave a record of exactly what you've done and how things were organized. So when Pelliot gets there the year after and sees it disorganized, his assumption is it was sealed in haste, possibly when the temple complex was under attack and they were trying to preserve materials. And it's almost certain that the disorder was caused by what Stein had done and what this Buddhist monk had done before then. So they're trying to publish everything in this. And so the Germans are mainly doing it with Manichaean texts and the French are mainly doing it with the Buddhist texts. And it's a limited corpus, and this is why some of the problems of interpretation, at least as I understand it, are arising. Because unlike, say, Greek or Latin or Sanskrit, you don't have that much larger body of work that can enable interpretive questions to be resolved by comparison. Thanks. They're working with such a small body, but the corpus, the textual material is so limited that one person, whether it's Gautier first who doesn't complete it, or then Banerji, can publish all of the text in language in transcription. But then they're trying to work out the grammar of the language, the vocabulary of the language from this very small amount. And that's why there are texts like this on the others that are trying to deal with that.
I'm trying to piece out the two. I feel like there are two parts in your question, and one is sort of what is the kind of level of this conversation? Where does it hit? Where is it touching down? And part of it is how do we get? And I think that's the challenge of a bit of this project, which is grappling with reception of this thing I've been working on. Having to think, how do we get better to hear up to this one hand remainder discourse that we'll see. And so at some level, it's a kind of epistemic analysis and kind of taking on narratives of ruptures between ancient and modern. I didn't mention Foucault, but Foucault himself in Les Mots shows makes sympathy very much the defining and organizing of order and reality before modernity. And again, you have a narrative of absolute rupture. So part of it is to sort of intervene at that level in the stories we tell ourselves about the ontology of the Western or life or nature and all of those questions where I'm trying to come up with models that we can trouble, as it were, that idea of pure rupture or continuity, find a way of thinking of a fold in which these texts and these ways of thinking about life and the past survive into and actually structure the ways in which value is being determined and new in a kind of secular modernity in its investment in both the nature and life. And where is that happening? I mean, from an institutional level, primarily, I'm thinking a lot about the formation of both academic classics and academic biology at the beginning of the 19th century, 18th century. Now, I know more about the formation of academic classics, the rise of the modern research, the rest where classics become sort of the original science. And Glenn Most and Rainey Daston have done important work on showing how there was a real sort of mutually reinforcing dialogue between the physical sciences and science of antiquities. Think about how you create a sort of proper science. But at the same time, and this is where Harlow's work comes in on Winkelmann, there's always a question of like, why pursue this highly specialized training on Greek and Latin? Tell a story now of why Greek and Latin get hived off from the Oriental languages, because you can do this kind of scientific study, super theological knowledge. Why does it matter? You've got to produce an idea of the value of this tradition, and that value is supplied by Philhellenism and the classical body of the Romantic body, and so forth. Now, there's two places, I mean, one could sort of go with this. One is part of that story of the formation of the Modern Research University. Well, we're sort of living it in terms of why in terms of classical value, but I'm not going to go there. The ways in which that operation in the 19th century in Germany is also deeply entwined with the history of the museum and the history of archaeological sites. So that monumentality, the site of classicism being produced in archaeological sites, heritage, UNESCO, the Parthenon, all the rest, and the museum. I mean, this is how it's getting diffused in ways that exceed a scale of intellectual history to sort of document at the scale one would want as a proper intellectual historian. But I see a connection between this movement diasporically from this 1800 moment through these institutions that saturates a world that we live in which we're constantly being told stories of value through a body that's linked to both life and the other thing I just want to plant a flag, because this is all very quick, is that part of this is about critique and part of this is about the history of philosophy and the stories we tell ourselves. Kangam, we could go from Kangam to Les Mots, Les Choses, and then to biopolitics and late Foucault. And it's so many stories that are being told about biopolitics and the history of life and the history of nature in critical theory are organized by, in my mind, overly simplistic narratives of either there was a total rupture, life is invented in 1800, and before that it was all really different, or a gambit. And where it's all Vedic, antiquity, origins, and so on and so forth. And so the failure to actually really grapple with this particular formation at the juncture of antiquity and modernity called bioclassis means like we can't actually interrogate the blind spots of a whole discourse around biopolitics that's organizing right now. Well, I wondered if I actually, because there was something that you said, Anurima, which I feel like I wanted to hear more about, which is directly on this question, where you talked about the relationship between sociological analysis, particularly with the movement away from down the caste oppressed bodies to and discourse analysis. So maybe it would be great to hear you talk more and probably on this question.
No, it's, yeah, actually, I'm glad to have the opportunity to do that because right now in the context of Indian dance discourse, there's a very important intervention happening by dancers and scholars who come from many communities who were marginalized during the classicization process. So that's a whole history that has actually been written about from a critical perspective by many dance scholars. So they've looked at each of the forms. In particular, Bharatanatyam has been the ground in which many of these debates have been occurring in the last largely 5 years about caste politics and class politics. Because in Bharatanatyam lineages in particular, there were caste oppressed groups who were identified as performers in Bharatanatyam's history. And so the dance was really transferred out of their bodies in a coercive way in the 1930s. So just as classical discourse is ascending and the concept is becoming more entrenched, then it's being appropriated. The dance is being appropriated by dominant caste and class bodies right in that moment. Because there have been negative associations made between the caste status as well as the sexuality of the dancers who were performing historically in a range of practices that were renamed. They were consolidated and refashioned and renamed as Bharatanatyam. So that's one history of classicism that's very important on the sociological front. And that's what's really been investigated. The story is different depending on which form you look at. So the story is quite similar when you think of Kuchipudi. There's some other forms as well, where it was actually dominant caste groups who were only allowed to dance a particular form. So the story is not the same across all the classical dances. But what we can say is that this debate has been important because caste was not really a topic that was addressed substantially, even as part of an intersectional framework in the critical scholarship, until those from the communities who are seeking now to really showcase what obstacles and caste discrimination still remain in the field until they became vocal in the media as well through their performance practices. So people like Yashoda Thakur, Nritya Pillai, scholars like Samina Dalwai, who is not from those communities, but investigates caste in cabarets and bar dancing contexts. Brahma Prakash is another scholar who has looked at caste in the folk dance forms and so on. It's this new material that is really transforming the space of dance in the context. So one thing I wanted to do was talk about that sociological element as a separate phenomenon from the discourse of classicism as it emerged in this late 18th century moment, not because there isn't, of course, an interweaving between the sociological and discursive realms, but because if we take classicism for granted as a concept, then I think that's the troubling that needs to happen in conjunction with this, in a sense, pluralizing the history of classicism as it's otherwise developed. So if we think of the discourse of classicism as it emerged, it's very much, I think, still tied to caste dominance. There's a Brahminical discourse of classicism that definitely influenced the shaping of classicism as an idea. But at the same time, it meant different things in different dance contexts. So I don't want to presume that the history of Bharatanatyam can be extrapolated and then its insights applied to, for example, Odissi or Manipuri, because they're very different regional histories, caste histories, class histories, and cultural histories that are created in the formation of each form. So I wanted to look at, again, just ideologically what unites the classical dances. And it's a tenuous kind of unity that's proposed in the first place, because in India, there is no definition of what a classical dance is. And the Sangeet Natak Academy, which is charged with the task of determining what should be part of the classical dance canon or not, it doesn't have a definition of what classicism is. I'm trying to draw empirically from studying these different forms what we can discern as classical first. And secondly, there's still no clear definition. So keeping the term elastic has had a proper function for this state in its eyes of remaining open to what classical candidates might be. So I find this very fascinating. I find the concept empty. And then the state has actually even bolstered this idea of emptiness by refusing to articulate.
Where's open? The back?
This was so wonderful. Having been trained as a Roman historian in classics departments and growing up dancing Bharatanatyam, so it's like everything I love and everything that's traumatized me. I wanted to, Brooke, you were kind of going in this direction about the role that pedagogical institutions play in the transference of these ideas, particularly across orders of different kinds, and particularly across like imperial and colonial spaces. And I have a question that's kind of particularly geared towards Anurima, but maybe there are ways of addressing it from your other two perspectives as well, which is the role that the diaspora and diasporic institutions play in the reinforcement of the classical. The lack of kind of knowledge within the diaspora, speaking from my own personal, very narrow, very privileged perspective of, where the classical emerges, that it's an anachronistic concept in its, because it doesn't exist, right? And I'm thinking, I guess, in particular, of, being in many dance classes, many workshops with famous dancers who say, my version is not innovative because that's a claim you don't want to make. But mine is more classical, mine is more ancient because I'm looking at the Natya Shastra or whatever. And, so I'm thinking of like that as a kind of pedagogical space, right? In addition to like the university pedagogical space, but also kind of cultural institutions like Dhamma Sangam and things like that, which are for specific ethno-linguistic communities in the diaspora, right? And how they showcase the classical styles of their region, of their state. And I always kind of grew up with this sense of kind of competition among the classical styles, right? In part because the concept of the classical is so empty at the institutional level in India too. And so this is why Bharatanatyam has this almost like cultural hegemony in the diaspora, at least in the Indian American diaspora. I don't know about outside of it. So I don't have a clear question, but I'm curious if you're thinking about this in your book, because I think what happens in the diaspora also informs what's happening in the homeland, right? And it's not simply like a one-way movement of ideas, that there is a tremendous amount of power exerted, right, by Indian Americans and particularly Brahmin Americans, in terms of the like money that they can harness, right? Which is why we see now in American politics too, like the most horrific politics. So anyway, that's kind of what thinking as you.
Where you answer? Emily, do you want to go ahead? But we can take questions two at a time.
Okay, so I have a question for you, Stuart. Benveniste is such a general relevance to classics, but I think So correct me if I'm wrong, you're kind of situating him early Benveniste in a field that sometimes is referred to as linguistic archaeology. In terms of the history of peoples and especially the Indo-European. Were there Chatterjee's early 20s later, but you know, so it's sort of up for grabs what this field is called, because then you have more structural Soviet style linguistics influencing how Benveniste thinks about language and philology. And then overlaid on that, you have Benveniste is a kind of a unique figure who almost approaches grammar philosophically, where it really is stretched into concept work, into cultural grammars. So this neat example, which I love just because so often that everything can hinge on just one word, you know, but would you, I mean, maybe you could just say a little bit more about, for me, Benveniste is really a unique figure in this history of philology and the history. I don't know where he fits in with classicism, but anyway, it's an open question.
So the way that I try to make sense of where Banerji is from in the early formation is almost a parallel figure to Georges de Maizière, who's the other main person I'm looking at project in France. And that I try to see them as formed from two. One is the linguistic one, Antoine Mellet, or that Bernard de Saussure, who teaches for a decade in Paris before he goes back to Geneva to do the famous course on Sanskrit and comparative grammar in Paris. Before that, Michel Briel, who was the French translator of Franz Bopp, lineage of that through to Mellet. Mellet, we really, as I see it, kind of saying to his students, right, you need to work on this branch of the Indo-European, work on this one, and sort of apportioning the parts of it to that. So one side is that linguistic training. The other is, I think, what's happening in France in sort of sociology and anthropology, Durkheim students, so Henri Aubert and Marcel Mauss. And one thing that has become clear to me, partly because of a PhD that Sylvia Fregeni wrote on kind of Banerji as an anthropologist, as much as he is a linguist, and then reading Banerji's work through that kind of lens of being aware that there are lots of works of his that are, yes, they're informed by linguistics, but they're also doing something other than purely talking about the people. They're talking about practices. They're talking about language, families, and movements. That twin formation for me is really helpful. And so this is why, for me, there's many contrasts between Banerji and de Maizière. Banerji is primarily a linguist who does really interesting and important work on cultures and anthropology, and de Maizière is a mythologist who also does a lot of interesting work on linguistics. So they're kind of contrasting figures in the way that they approach this. But when you come to Banerji's late published, but I think composed much earlier, the vocabulaire or the dictionary of Indo-European concepts or institutions, it's using those tools of historical critical linguistics to shed light on the practices, the social, economic, and political structures. At the same time that the social and political economic structures can shed light on the linguistics, around. So that's broadly how I'm trying to situate him within a French tradition, but there are extra French connections. That's where this project is in danger of just getting completely out of control because of how networked these European debates and then beyond European debates. And that's what's interesting about this project. It's kind of trying to connect it to what's going on in England, to what's going on in Germany. I mentioned the the Andreas, his students, but then Walter Henning ends up in England in exile because his fiance is Jewish. So he has to leave Germany. He ends up later in Berkeley teaching in California. So there's a kind of a whole set of networks around it. And then the connection to Roman Jakobson and the kind of the Prague school is important. And I'm beginning that work of exploring that at the moment. But that's, so I want to read Balinese as not just a narrowly understood linguist.
So just a very quick follow-up.
So
question.
you have a
I
you
just
have
want
a
to
question.
respond
you have to
to-
answer,
yeah.
But
Sorry,
go ahead, no, please.
Thank you so much for the question, because it's so important in underlining the transnational aspect, whether it's through diaspora or through the conversations that were happening in the early 20th century. Actually, the modern dance worlds in the US as well as Europe forming the notion of the classical with dance specialists. But later on, after we see diasporas really emerging and becoming so influential, certainly there's, it's not at all a unilinear imposition of the idea. So I think you're right in suggesting that it's continually reiterated, and the power of reiterating classicism then becomes important in securing this idea of Indian heritage worldwide, wherever we see Indian diasporas appear, right? But I think there's also the political economy of the term that I want to pay attention to. It's not in the scope of my book because I do end in the 1950s when we emerge from the colonial states' enshrinement of classicism and then the Indian states' enshrinement of it. So those are the two bookends of the project. But in terms of the research, beyond that, we can see how important it is in the contemporary sense because classicism is used as an index of that Hindu heritage. The reason why I want to focus on the nation in particular is because we have then this glorification of the dance form as an embodiment of that heritage at the national scale. That's not happening so much in diasporic settings, just because of the multiracial character and the minoritization of South Asian forms in those contexts. Nevertheless, the ideological power continues to resonate. And I think part of the issue is that classicism gives a kind of language of valuation and worth that then allows for minoritized practices to stand in relation to more hegemonic forms. So I'm specifically thinking of ballet and how ballet has been such an important reference point for the making of the Indian classical dancing body, to the point where we still use the term ballet in Indian classical dance forms to talk about narrative, long sort of dance dramas, right? And even modern Indian dancers use the term ballet to legitimate their practices. So I think the diaspora definitely emerges as an economic and ideological force in retaining that power of the classical. And at the same time, classicism itself operates as such a currency in the dance art market. So I think there's a way in which they're reaching towards that existing valuation, as well as reinforcing the idea of Indian classicism as a specific subset of classicism at large. So there's so many forces working here. It's the art market, it's dance as a global marketplace, right? And it's this idea of classicism that actually in the name of decolonization is being reclaimed also and restored as a marker of triumphalism and the glorification of that past. So there's so many forces working together in the contemporary moment to define and redefine the classical. I think that's different in a way from the forces that were active in the mid-20th century, who often saw this move to create a classical discourse of the dancing body, almost like many would say as a post-colonial lexical resistance. term. And they were trying to pluralize it in their own way. So I think the liberal politics of that moment are different from the way Hindutva now is appropriating classicism and how the diaspora uses classicism to assert itself. So word is they on that, but I'll end there.
Hello. So which may or may not help connect your topic to the greater kind of theme of the panel on the classicism project and its more troubling, potentially troubling aspects. So the quick question was that in your study of Benveniste and Gautier's studies of Chaldean, you find them in conversation not just with Indo-Europeanists around the world, but also with sinologists who are working with the same body of work. And the reason why this flagged in my mind is because the à genoux term is a pretty close calque to a classical Chinese term. And so it's, if they were in conversation with sinologists, that would be curious to see whether or not they picked up on this. If they were not in conversation with sinologists, then what might they say about this greater Indo-Europeanizing project, that they would seek connections more with Celtic Ireland than with classical Chinese, which is right next door and has, you know, documented close exchanges of trade and commerce through in that exact period.
When introducing yourself, sorry, I should have said this.
Sure. Hi, my name is Aditi. I'm a student in the classics department at Princeton. And this has been such a generative set of papers to hear together in large part because actually maybe the body is the one thing that is not troubled in these three sets of papers. Which is to say that, Stuart, in your case, so much of this comparison rests upon the fact that the knee is one thing in the Celtic tradition. And so it has to look the same, it has to be in the same place, it has to perform the same function in this like trans-global context. And in your case, like this rests upon the potential for the body to still be able to execute the Shastric tradition's commands and disciplinary demands. And so like in both of these cases, we see the body is necessitating a kind of continuous formulation and articulation across a global context and then across this like massive millennia-wide time span, which I think raises the question of whether, in fact, to come back to the word you offered, Anurima, of a souvenir, whether our inability to refute classicism actually rests upon the fact that we possess bodies that are like refracted in made symmetrical in the classical traditions that we inherit. And so it's the fact that we have bodies that force us to return and return and return to an idea of the classical.
Well, sort of building on that, I'm not sure I'm going to be totally coherent here, but I was thinking a lot about, Anurima, what you said about the tension between doing and saying, between the rhetoric and the dance, ways in which there's a constant remaking rhetoric and an opposition to it. So, I mean, and I saw this going, like, what I took from the knee, since we were all thinking our own thing from the knee, was that not the knee, it's the gesture of two ways to what you're saying, there's the body, but there's also the gesture body and the movement of the ways in which the movement contradicts the word. Body, the people, the word, and then this gesture is what actually makes this thing eventually into a meaning that's accreted from various different experiences, gestures that finally it's just exists. Seems to me one way that classicism, and I'm I'm not sure, Brooke, whether this article talking about, but is there a way in which classicism works from the future? This kind of, we're all revealing a history that unsettles something that we accept. But I guess what I'm trying to wonder, is there a kind of movement in that? Is that the vitalism? Is there a way in which the linguistics of gesture is included in the? I'm thinking of the work of Johnny's apathy, that you introduced me to, which is very much troubling the body by doing things rather than saying things, which is a political position as well. She's working in a state that is not tolerant. So anyway, this is a little bit just coherent, but please.
CJ, Pompeo is a sinologist, and that when he comes back from this expedition with all of the plunder that he brings back, he gets elected to a chair at the College of France. He's supposed to spend the rest of his career publishing all of this material, and what I can't always work out is whether he gets an author credit on things because he's actually contributed to the publication, or it's a bit like a big science grant. You know, once you got the grant, you end up with an author credit on every paper that uses that to do the analysis. I think he sometimes has a kind of proprietary right to, if he brought the text back to Paris, he ends. So Gautier was working with him on the edition of the Sutra that I mentioned, and he is tasked on things that Pelliot himself feels that he cannot work on through Melee to work on these texts. The other major sinologists that they're all in contact with, and this relation to dance, is Marcel Gronet, writes about Chinese dance. And Gronet is an important anthropologist of China in France at this time. So they would have, Dumézil was certainly taught by him, I suspect, about it. So they were in contact with people that would have been able potentially to make these links to China. Senses, I might be wrong on it, my senses, they were so obsessed that this had to be within the Indo-European language family, they would have largely ignored the material that didn't fit. That's why what Banerji is doing in this piece on the knee is he's taking a text that he's written about Old Irish, he's pairing it to somebody who's already noted that there are some links between Old Irish and Eastern languages, and he's triangulating and saying, well, actually, I can unlock a puzzle that is there in this edition of this Sogdian version of this text. But they were in contact with sinology. So if there is a link, as you say, which is fascinating, there is a link. Surprising that they didn't know that they didn't look. But I wonder whether it was so obsessive at that time, either working within that family, the language family, I think.
I'd love to know actually what Brooke thinks about this, because I was interested in the idealization. Better thing also. So which you say are not a sign of pure rupture, but a continuity. Is interesting.
Well, I mean, I was trying to think, this came up actually talking before about the kind of role of iconicity and the sculptural body and the way that it both becomes an index of something that risks reinscribing body into this in the context of modern context, that would be, you know, post-Cartesian work. So the statue both invites and insists in certain ways. And you know, what's challenging then is to think about, you know, so I think that's a point of shared convergence. I think, Aditi, this goes to what you're talking about. You know, but I'm trying to wonder, like, is the body assumed
in the analysis, or some other body is being assumed by all three of us, the real body.
There's like an inalienable construction of the body, like our parts have to somehow be like represented in space.
Right, because I think that there's a challenge between, let me put it like this, like, so I would resist the idea, like, I'm always sort of onto this thing that the physical body has a genealogy and it's reborn at this moment, possibly biological body. So I wouldn't, part of the point of provincializing this long cosmoanthropological, natural body is to say, I can't assume that this body is the same as the body, in the Sogdian text or in, even in the South Asian context. There's too much of a collapse between the way we think about the body and the biological physical body. But we might imagine some, when you're thinking about interstitial incorporation, there are affects that haven't been organized, right? And we organize them in various ways into ourselves, unities with ourselves, forms of knowledge that master living bodies and their relations to each other. And part of it is to try to peel back to the space where that, it sounds very Deleuzian, I realize, kind of space of, affects or intensities is not yet disciplined by forms of classicization that have structural similarities in the ways that they try to impose form and iconicity for state purposes or hegemonic purposes on the body. On the one hand, so those are structural, but there's also complex relations of contact in all three of these cases. These are all practices, European philology, the state formation of Indian classical dance and the work that I'm describing, around Indian medicine. They're all shaped by structures of classicization, Greco-Roman classicization, around 17, So I think, in the 18th, 19th century. So there's also these forms of contact that I think complicate any attempt to sort of do what's sometimes done when you imagine comparative work, which is to reify each person's ontology or body by putting them next to each other. Unfortunately, that's also not possible. So maybe, I don't know if that's helpful.
Absolutely. I think actually what both of you are saying are complementary in terms of the way that I'm seeing it. So yes, classicism exists. That's one potential, right, for the body to organize itself. But there are other kinds of possibilities too. Not to say that the folk or the tribal or the contemporary categories also didn't organize their bodies in problematic, troubling, and troubled ways. But classicization, I think, is really interesting, problematic. So we're confronted with, I think, two ideas of the body, and I do want to argue the body is troubling. So in one way, it's not. It's very much aligned because it's sculpted in relation to the discourse. But if we actually do a choreographic analysis of what the contents of the classical are, then we find in it traces and imprints of so many citations and sources that are not classical. It's defined in the Indian classical dance. That if we want to look critically at this contents of classical dance, we can find the process of interstitial incorporation working, right? So we find the sources that are not classical as a kind of palimpsest, if you will, or to me, actually, they're quite explicitly available. When I'm dancing, then I can see the repertoire of symbologies that are contained within that body. It's just that they've been interpreted as classical rather than having us as dancers look at the materials as non-classical sources and then describing them and critically shaping our discourse around what is actually happening in the body. So that's why I want to argue that when we look at what the body is physically articulating, it's undermining the discourse of classicism and what it's saying. So I think that might answer a bit of what you both were bringing up. On the other hand, I don't want to discount the fact that there is this meeting of body and discourse that you talked about, that there's a command that's situated by classicism, the body that emerges in response. So both things are happening at the same time, the reification through dance practice and the undoing through. I want to call that, a very, yes, process that's occurring there. I like the way that you're positioning this idea of the body, right, as being untroubled. So I do think it's troubled when it's related to the classical ideology in particular.
Two short questions, which I've been putting, and I'm sorry to be holding off everybody else, Linda and Ina.
I'm Linda Karshan. I make performance drawings. Very recently, I did a walked drawing in the Western Range of the British Museum. Those galleries very well, and I have direct experience with them. And I would say, in terms of, you use the word sympathy. For me, there is a greater sympathy with the group classical sculptures of the Parthenon in the Duveen galleries or in the Parthenon galleries than with the other classical forms. It's just a kind of classicism to which I relate better. But I say sympathy, perhaps it's a very naive use of the word. It's not a rhetorical thing in my case. But I've noticed, I was in the British Museum galleries not so very long ago. It is remarkable how so many more visitors to the British Museum, those galleries, and the other gallery, and they're fascinated and asking all kinds of questions. So I think those forms are powerful. That kind of Greek classicism continues to be very powerful. Fascinatingly, it was the great Indian poet Karthika Nair wrote an ekphrastic poem in response to my work there. And there we bring it together. She too is in sympathy. And she, as you know, puts dance on there. So, brings together two of the papers.
It's a very quick question. Happy to just follow afterwards if there's no time. But there's about, you had 1800 as I mean, obviously another one would be like 1950 or 60 with the molecularization of life. And I was wondering how your bioclassicism narrative or sort of troubling of narrative sort of intersects with that one, because I could sort of see a sort of turn to classicism among critical theory as a sort of response to sort of another second wave of mechanization through molecular biology. But
I mean, I have a short answer because I haven't worked out the boundary. And I think that's all in my head. But I think, that Stefan Helmreich piece on What Was Life, where he's really, is which, the class that we did on vitalism was like kind of inspired by this question, like, and what really struck me was his diagnosis of the persistence in AI, that in fact, in the technologies we're building, in the ways we think about code and matter, we're perpetuating the kinds of ontologies that sort of saturate the hegemonic to, kind of notion of classical life might conform to, and that it's different from astrobiology or deep sea biology, where actually like close observation, of these forms of life produce ways of thinking about life in relation that completely challenge what that AI model is reproducing. The AI model that we're spreading through the world, and it's these other micro habitats that we're destroying. So, I think that there is a persistence and a quite urgent persistence. And I remember talking about, I'm not a biologist, but like the way that there's gene transfers among these like sea creatures, like outside reproduction. And I was like bringing this up at a conference with the Nobel Prize winner in biology and his wife, who's also a biologist. And he was like, well, that's not the normal way, it is true. She was like, that is it was a really interesting exchange where it was like, clearly even that model, which Helmreich is documenting as another way of thinking of this, was like in that context being sort of like, well, that's not the normal way we should think about genetic transfer. I thought that was a really interesting I'm going to make one other maybe response. Like, so there's a question about the Parthenon sculpture. So, I mean, one could say many things, but what came to mind when you were speaking was like, I'm more on Aristotle in his idea of habitat. He has this idea, which is like quite funny, that I think people don't
understand, like, we don't realize how weird it is that like the stuff you eat is like what we're made of is then the stuff that you eat. You know, so it has things to do with like the maternal body, and the nutriment, you know, like the residue of generation that produces the nutriment. And then he seems to think about habitat in the same way that like, and he actually says in the history of animals, like we're attracted to the things that we are sort of made out of. And I think there's a kind of cultural, so that's not an ontological claim, that's not a biological claim. What I mean to say by that, taking Aristotle in, because is actually like in cultural forms, like what's naturalized and normed as beautiful in a dominant hegemonic system where like, classical Greek statues are everywhere. We feel an attraction to that feels natural. And part of my project would be to denaturalize that, right? So of course, in London, it's primarily hegemonically saturated by these forms as natural and beautiful. So if there are more people there, that may reflect that hegemony, but like, it's not to deny the affective, real way in which the attraction is felt.
it was so powerful 3 weeks ago to see everybody there and to listen to these visitors clearing the guards. It just was long, long conversations. They want to know a lot. And the British Museum right now has a pamphlet out. A model of euphemism, a model of why they're holding on to this. Our Greek colleagues, surely Lord Duveen did not rip them off the walls. We bought them and so on. So it's a defense of why they're going to keep them down. I'm in that court. I want to keep them too, because everyone can see them for free. But that is the British position. But I think I saw something beyond that. I saw every culture in the world is there. And they're
Hegemonic cultural forms.
Well, that's what I saw.
Yeah.
So I can't speak from a scholarly point of view. I can say my experience.
Yeah.
That's
No, we're talking about experience.
We're
There's
talking
not a
about-
hard
that's my
break here
experience.
between
Yeah.
nature and culture. We're talking about the formation of experience.
Yes, and Indian, my wonderful friend Kartika Nair understood that perfectly, captured it in the form of her words. Thanks for the ideas.
No, I just think it just speaks to the power of how the classical is so naturalized.
Yeah.
And how entrenched it continues to be despite all the criticism.
So, thank you, all three of you, so much for your presentations. Listening to you, we've gone way over time, so I really appreciate the way it speaks to the interest. And
Mhm.
I was going to close with my reference to what the knee meant for me, which you didn't quite cite, sort of to my surprise, namely that the heirs of Meillet proceed to first refer to the master who's on his knees begging or directing, but from his knees, then to the heir son, and then to the tender loving son. A great way of describing themselves. It's also a great suggestion of an audience in this scenario. So I think that that little tweak as to where this puts us in a position. Thank you, Stuart. Thank you, Brooke. Thank you, Anurima.